Good evening from my HEPA chapter.
Uh,
Do I have to make the welcome or you, Andreas?
Hello, hello everybody. We are very pleased to have you here, and in this special conversation with two of very high-profile personalities, character, and influencers. I can say that influencers, Mr. Langfan, which is a businessman and the president of the Americans for the Sake of Israel. Unfortunately, Mr. Brown Johnson has some internet problems, and well, we're trying to fix those problems, right? This event, this conversation, is a part of HEPA chapter AG41, patronage from HEPA, of course, and in affiliation with the Mediterranean Council and Forum. Thank you very much as well, ProNews, .gr side for the communication sponsorship, and of course thank you Ms. Vasilia Prasyuti, which she is also daughter of Penelope member from Ceres, and I would like to welcome my friends Mark Langfan from Florida, United States, and as I mentioned before,
thanks for having me.
He's thank you, Mark. He's one of my most, let's say, most important friends, because I followed Mark several years ago when I discovered that he talked about Mediterranean important region, how important is region almost 30 years ago, not almost 30 and plus years ago. And since then, I started to follow, let's say, very fanatic Mark Langfan, and I'm very glad to have you here today, Mark. As I said before, we will try to fix the problem, to fix the problem with internet with Mr. Johnson, but we will not lose any time. I will pass the floor to Ms. Vasilia Prasyuti, she is Balkan and international affairs expert. Thank you, Vasilia, to having you here. And I pass the floor to you to start our conversation, please, with Mr. Langfan. Well, I would like to welcome all our friends. Which are they are online now. And Vasilia, the floor is yours.
Mr. Langton, I was reading an online newspaper and I had an article in front of me about the Palestinian terrorist which continues to plague the Jewish people amid the pandemic. The journalist was Russell Abram from Jewish News. I would note your note in this statement, as Mr. Russell Abraham said that neither Fatah or Hamas appear to be grateful for this life-saving assistance that they receive from Jewish state.
I didn't hear the question exactly.
I had read in the newspaper an article about why Palestinian terrorists continues to plague Jews amid the pandemic. The journalist Russell Abram said that neither Fatah or Hamas appear to be grateful for the life-saving assistance that they received from Jewish state during the pandemic. Do you have to note something on this statement?
From what I understand, Israel has done its best to make available a lot of equipment necessary for the protection, the personal protection, as well as any kind of medicines, and also has made available medical services to some degree. But again, you know, the Gaza Strip is a whole terrible situation unto itself with respect to the sanitation and the conditions there that are really the result of the rocket fire that the Hamas the Hamas fires these rockets, and so Israel has to, in some regard, keep a blockade on Israel's side of the Gaza Strip. But we should never forget that Egypt is also keeping a blockade on their side of the Gaza Strip because the Gaza Strip has Hamas, which is Muslim Brotherhood, which is in effect enemies of Egypt and has caused all kinds of terrorist acts in the Sinai, as well as when there was the Islamic overthrow of Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood. All the leaders essentially came from the Gaza Strip, and Hamas helped the Islamic Brotherhood take over Egypt. So when Sisi took back Egypt, the relationship between Egypt and Hamas was not particularly good. So Hamas is really a threat to both Israel as well as Egypt, unfortunately.
Yeah, we guess so. We know the reasons, but we would like to discuss about this more. What do you think about the relationship between Israel and Greece to all this terrorism?
Well, it's, what's happened was you had the Turkish ship Marmara come through and cause all those problems in around the year 2010, I believe, 2010, 2000, and they needed Cyprus to dock at to be able to make the trip to Israel. So in around 2010, I think it was around then, I published my first map. This is a version of it. I published a map that showed how vital Israel was to Cyprus and Greece. And after that, there were no Turkish ships that were allowed to transit through Cyprus, and the relationship has blossomed between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel to now really be a burgeoning, as Secretary Pompeo said, the Israel, Greece, and Cyprus have formed a strategic frontier of the United States, which is a dramatic statement, which did not go report. It's the craziest thing. It did not go reported in the New York Times, that where you should understand, in America, Greek Americans happen to be very, very Democrat. They happen to be Democrats, a lot of them. And if Greek Americans understood how vital Israel was to Greece, there would be a revolution in the Democrat Party.
We would like to have a full stop here to welcome Mr. Johnson, but we would like to discuss more about this because everyone wants to see your map. If you would like to share the image with us and to explain exactly what's going on with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel in geopolitics.
Okay, sure.
So, Mr. Zapimitis, we have to welcome Mr. Johnson or not?
Of course. Welcome, Brad. Welcome, Mr. Johnson. How are you? Can you hear me good? Mr. Johnson, can you hear me good?
I hear you decently, not very well, but
all right.
okay, I can hear you okay.
You are welcome together, Mr. With us is Mr. Langfan. The moderator for today is Ms. Prasyuti. Welcome again. We are talking with Mr. Langfan. We have started already. And before we will continue, I would like to little bit support your work, Vasilia. Please, I want from both of you the open statement about the situation in the Mediterranean. Please, Mr. Johnson, you can start, and then Mr. Langfan, you can continue to explain us the current situation in the Mediterranean region. Mr. Johnson.
Unfortunately, the single key word cut out on me, and you want me to talk about a country or a region? I'm sorry I missed that. Forgive me.
Region, the Mediterranean region. I'm saying, repeat, please tell us about the current situation in the Mediterranean region.
I believe that it's becoming more and more dangerous as time goes by. That would be my overall assessment, I think. And certainly at the forefront of that, I think, is the conflict that is developing, particularly between Turkey and Greece. I think that's something that's certainly heating up. Turkey has stated that they have every intention of, say, drilling for oil in waters that are claimed by Greece, things like that. We've got the Cyprus conflict that appears to be heating up. So as far as flashpoints go, I would put that very high on the list as dangerous. We're seeing other things in the Mediterranean come in and try to exert influence, certainly from even Iran
Mr. Johnson,
the problems with Russia coming in.
I can hear you very well. The microphone has an issue about the voice. Your voice sounds like a robotic, you know. And please, can you repeat? I could hear only that the situation between Greece and Turkey is very dangerous. All right? Can you repeat that, please? Your last words, because I couldn't hear very well. I have a problem here with your issue, with your voice. Yeah, sorry. We missed the connection. So, Mr. Lackman, back to you. Can you tell me, please, your opinion about the current situation in the Mediterranean region?
The currents. By the way, Andreas, I sent you a page, a photo that if you could include it if you could post it somehow on this thing,
all right,
that would be great.
I will try.
Where we are today is really a combination of two different wars. You have the Crimea War, where you have Russia wanting to enter the Mediterranean, and for some reason, the Russians at the time thought that the Europeans would welcome this because Russia would be an anti-Islamic force in the Mediterranean. That's one bold construct. The other construct is World War II, the battle over North Africa, where you have the British to the east and the Nazis to the west. And you have a fight in Libya. Now, you sort of have a strange mix of both of these conflicts. And where Greece fits in is when the real horror of the situation began when President Obama authorized the deposing of Gaddafi. This was done in no small part at the behest and suggestion of Turkey, where Turkey and Qatar were sort of partners in convincing the Obama administration that Gaddafi should get knocked out. Now, Turkey was thinking long term. They knew that if Gaddafi got knocked out, you would have an open sesame to introduction of Turkey into Libya. And that is the heart of the problem that we are facing today. Because Turkey and Libya, or the quote unquote official government of Libya, signed a mutual declaration of economic zones.
That's
And,
true. That's true. But allow me to say that this is not official. I mean, this is between two
oh, it's not official.
countries.
Oh, I agree with you.
All right.
But you have to understand where they're going. Okay,
Right.
where
Of course.
Turkey
Of
is
course.
going is, if you look at the map of that agreement, they have violated every aspect of Greek sovereignty, especially over the Mediterranean, that is really Greece's Mediterranean, because, and this is where the topography actually becomes also important. If you look at the Greek islands and Greece, you will see that they're under the law of the sea. The country that has the shelf, that shelf is the ownership of the country. So even though you don't see it, it's under the water. That land that's under the water, if it's part of the continental shelf connected to that country, is the country's economic zone. So what has happened is that Greece, through its connection with its puppet in Libya, has created a zone that infringes on Greece's sovereign continental shelf in the Mediterranean. And Turkey has gone so far as sending its navy to harass ships that are in
That's true.
the Cyprus area. So you can imagine what is going to be coming down the pike if you have a Turkish definition with Libya of what is its right to the Mediterranean, and they start sending out their navy to protect that right. It's in effect a violation of NATO, because NATO says any armed force impinging on a neighbor, on a NATO country, is a violation of is an Article 5 defensive can be, the defense of NATO can be invoked. So we're talking about a very serious violation of Greece's sovereignty that is coming down the line. And
Okay.
add to it the consequences to Russia if that zone is established and created. So you have, because they want access to the Mediterranean, and if
Of course.
Turkey has
Of course.
created this, so all of this is going on, and it's basically going on because you have Libya being in a free-for-all between the Turks on one side and the Egyptians and the Russians on the other side. And it's really all coming in no small part from Turkey's expansive Islamist, nationalistic, Ottoman, neo-Ottoman expansionism, which is not a good thing.
Of course, it's not a good thing. But let me add something here, and let's allow me, Miss Prasyuti, to ask something. what is the policy of Israel according with your last information, Mr. Langfan?
Yeah.
And last week, the Prime Minister of Greece met with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and they signed an agreement about the terrorism and about the policy against the counter-terrorism policy in the Mediterranean. Do you think
Absolutely.
that those measures, I have in front of me the agreement, and I focused on this line, all right? And both leaders agreed about to face together the terrorism in the Mediterranean. You think that through Greece and Israel in these Turkish violations, they are true allies or they are hidden agenda? Or there exists hidden agenda? I'm asking you, and I know I want to keep this record because you are for in a global, let's say, size, you are one of the most well-informed analysts about the Israel issues, right? At least in the United States. So, you think that this let's say alliance, it's true? It's based on the true facts, or it's there is hidden agenda from the side of Israel?
Okay. In my belief, we've crossed a Rubicon with Israel and Turkey, in that Turkey, historically, you had very left-wing governments in Greece. I'm talking pre-2010 to 2005. You had very left of center Greek governments, where they had a narrative of the pro-Palestinian cause. And also concomitantly before that, you had a non-Islamist Turkey, where, of course, Israel would like to be as friendly as possible with a NATO Muslim country that was not seeking its annihilation. Okay, so since then, there's been a sea change. You have Turkey going to what can only be described as a pure Islamist country that is dedicated to Israel's annihilation. And on the other hand, you have a discovery of gas and natural resources in the Mediterranean that provided a first level interaction. Once that happened, that base was then further solidified by Turkey's going even more Islamist, where they're past the point of no return, in my view. Erdogan is it for the next 20 years. So there is no going back to Turkey. And on the flip side, you have a natural relationship of democracies where they need each other, meaning Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus need Israel, and Israel needs Greece and Cyprus. In fact, Greece and Cyprus represent the door through which Europe is, I believe, going to ultimately understand that South Europe is the soft underbelly of Europe. And without
That's right.
a natural, democratic, strong, southern, southeastern arc, there's Europe is in a terrible way.
Mr. Langfan, this is very interesting about the relations between the two countries. But do you believe that in the next months or years we will have a war between Greece and Turkey because of all these matters that we're discussing right now?
Oh yeah, I think this is on. I think this is on the front burner here. I think this is that's why Libya is really the tinderbox that could very well create and set the stage for a conflict with Greece. I believe the more likely scenario is that Turkey will first try to do something with Cyprus rather than Greece, because Cyprus is not a NATO country. But I think they are going. I think Turkey is going to be ratcheting up and trying to create as many facts as possible to put it into a position to press Greece and cause Greece to react in some way.
In your opinion, what would you suggest to Greek government to apply a strategy avoiding this bad connection between Libya, Cyprus, and Turkey? In your opinion, what the strategy that Greek government should develop in that way in the next months or years?
I think
More friendly
the,
NATO.
there appears to be in the Trump administration a reticence to taking on Turkey and to try to cool their demands. And you can't blame President Trump in this one, in that Turkey is a NATO country. And the last thing, with all the other crises that Trump has, is wanting to create a full-blown blow-up between America and Turkey. But at the same time, if it is not understood that a Turkish Libya takeover of Libya is going to create a hellacious situation for Greece and for the Mediterranean period, then I mean that's really what's got to happen, is that Greece has got to explain to the Trump administration that this is not just an end game of Turkey. This is their opening moves to control and cause a territorial violation of Greece that cannot be not met. So I think it is incumbent upon Greece to express the urgency, as well as, by the way, Russia. Russia has a role here to play in getting
Question. Think about Russia to all this gaming, if we can mention this word about this case.
say that again.
That was my next question about the role of Russia to all these Mediterranean issues.
Oh
And
yeah,
then I would like to ask also what's the USA strategy about the Mediterranean issues that we're talking about?
see, I think they're confused. I think they're on the fence. I don't think they have a strategy on Libya. I don't know. I have not seen there are some aspects of the Trump administration that is pro Turkey. And then there are for a while they looked like they were going with Egypt. I mean, Egypt, Greece, and Egypt and Greece have to work together and to sit together with the Trump administration and explain to the Trump administration that an introduction of Turkey to Greece, Turkey to Libya, will destabilize Egypt and will destabilize Greece. And the last thing, and that it's really got to be seen as exactly that. Does America want to lose the secularist Egyptian government? Because make no mistake about it, if Turkey is installed in Libya, the next problem you are going to have is a Muslim Brotherhood retakeover of Egypt. That is on, I mean, that was Turkey's whole claim to happiness when the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt. Who was there the next day giving speech coming to Cairo? It was Erdogan giving speeches saying Turkey and Egypt together represent 200 million people surrounding the Mediterranean. This is they've got to understand what a Turkish takeover of Libya will do to both Greece, which is a NATO country, and Egypt. Forget Israel for the moment. And then you add the Russia aspect. It's in Russia's worst strategic interest to have a takeover of Libya by Turkey.
Okay, thank you very much for the statement. Mr. Zaponidis, do you have any question about all this that we discussed till now? The situation.
I have a lot of, when the speaker is Mr. Langfan, my friend Mark, you cannot stop to him, right? You cannot stop. You don't want to interact, right? So I'll try to connect with Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, can you hear me now? Yes, the storms in Washington D.C. Are terrible. The weather is terrible, and the internet connection is very bad. So I will try to reach again Mr. Johnson. Can you hear me, Brad? I can hear you. I can hear you. Sorry, I can hear you. So I will continue, of course, with Mark. Mark, let's say that to summarize until now your opinion about the current situation, right? You told us that the Turkey sooner or later will attack in let's say Cyprus. It's more possible to attack Cyprus because it's a NATO member, all right, as I understand well, and that the relation between Israel and Turkey is very bad, and that the United States, they don't want to lose Egypt, all right. And I would like to ask And I would like to ask you, Brad, can you hear me now? I'm sorry, from our viewers, our followers, the situation there is a little bit, it's bad. The weather is bad in Washington. Brad, can you hear
Yes,
me?
it's
We
impacting. So
can
I've
see
switched to a
you,
new
but we
system.
cannot hear you. All right, we
Christine,
can hear you now. Please,
can you tell Dad I'm
please
on a conference call?
repeat, please repeat to our friends your opinion about the current situation in the Mediterranean.
Yes, I have heard bits and pieces of what you've been saying. And so a lot has been about the flashpoints that are around the Mediterranean. And certainly there's many of those sorts of situations. And I think everyone has talked about Greece and Turkey, with Turkey being in the more aggressive mode and wanting to drill in Greek waters. The problem there, of course, is now that we have both Greek and Turkish troops being gathered to the area. So this is being downplayed a bit by Turkey, but Greece is taking it very seriously. That is certainly a flashpoint. But there are other areas that are just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. And I would point out, for example, what's taking place in Libya. And we've seen Libya have now the fighting is not going on between Libyans. It now has outside groups that are coming in and supporting the various sides. And certainly we've seen Egypt has become a player, Russia has become a player, Turkey is a player, and there's certain backing from other groups like Iran has come in. So where you see these flashpoints where it starts to grow with the number of countries backing each other, and Turkey and Russia, for example, are beginning to face off in a number of different areas. And there's also other lateral pressures going on at the same time. For example, both France and Germany have talked recently about re-examining Turkey's NATO membership. So that puts certain pressures on the situation as well, because as everyone knows, Greece and Turkey are both members of NATO, and as are Germany and France, of course, as well, the United States and other countries. But there's many different types of pressures building up. It, I would say, is concentrated, generally speaking, in the area of the Mediterranean. Other flashpoints also exist, say, between China and India, as an example, but there's a high concentration of this in the Mediterranean area. So this begins to look similar to, in many ways, what we saw leading into World War I. There you had a lot of countries sort of balancing against each other, a lot of varied overlapping and antagonistic interests, and things like this can swing out of control. So, for example, if Turkey and Greece were to start a shooting war, which they've had wars recently and have a history of wars, and Russia, say, were to come in and back Greece, what would then happen? You have two NATO countries fighting each other. What would the other NATO countries if Russia was the one to come in and back Greece? So there's a lot of moving parts here, a lot of factors, and a lot of pressures pushing in a lot of different directions. So as far as like putting the Mediterranean on an kind of a higher alert status as to the dangers that are lurking there in the area, I would put it at a fairly high status.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for this
What do you
statement.
think? What do you think about the United States policy? I asked that before to the Mark, and I would like to hear your opinion too. What's the U.S. policy for the region, Brad?
Well, if I understood the question correctly, it's what are the U.S. policies towards the region? And I would say that, unfortunately, the policies in the region are fairly, slim. I don't think we've taken heavy positions with the current administration, so there's not really too much to say. In many ways, I think what has happened is the United States has kind of let Turkey have its way. And so the United States is following along more or less on the path that the Turks have pushed for. And I would again use Libya as an example of that. The regime that's in the capital, Tripoli, which is backed by Turkey, is not a particularly friendly regime to the United States and U.S. interests, where General Haftar on the other side of it was educated in the United States and is probably far more inclined to have a friendly relationship with the United States, yet the United States is backing the Turkish side of this. So I would say that this is something that hasn't really been looked at in depth in the United States, and it is a criticism I have here, and it's something I've brought out many times, that it's something that should be getting more attention from the United States than it's actually getting.
All right. Basilia, I think that
Uh,
you have a question from our friends in internet. We receive already questions from our friends, so we would like to share with you and to ask you. Basilia, the floor is yours.
I will start with Mr. Johnson because we have internet connection problems. So I will try to ask him at the moment that he is still online. Mr. Bradley, Mr.
Yes.
Johnson, excuse me. Turkey sent ISIS to Libya when they tried to get to Europe with LNA General. It is referred that GNA is the unrecognized government in Libya, but has been accused of accommodating extremist groups. What's your opinion about this?
Now, I did miss portions of the question, but I believe you were talking about ISIS going into Europe. Was that the crux of it?
Yes, Turkey said ISIS sent ISIS groups to Libya.
Yes, yeah, there are surrogate groups fighting in Libya. That's absolutely correct. I don't think there's any question of that. And there's various ones fighting on various sides. And as we've touched on, I apologize if I'm repeating things you've already discussed, but as I noted briefly earlier, certainly we've seen Egypt start to back the Haftar side of the fighting, and there are the surrogate groups that are both there and also in northern Syria, where we see these groups kind of fighting each other. Now, ISIS and Al Qaeda, for that matter, have both had presence, a fairly large presence in Europe for a very long time. So they certainly have capabilities in Europe as well. In this particular case, I think the greater danger right now to stability, particularly in Europe, and we're talking about the Mediterranean region. So particularly with regards to Europe, I think the greater danger is not ISIS at the moment. I think it's the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood has been largely consumed, perhaps is too strong a word, but their alignment and where they take their push for the management of their activities is more closely aligned with Turkey now. And so Turkey has a very large say, particularly in Europe, with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a very old organization, as I think most are aware, and also very effectively organized. They have a large capability to do a lot of things. So in the scheme of things, if it's talking about those sorts of groups, I would put Muslim Brotherhood in Europe as the more potentially dangerous group ahead of ISIS and Al Qaeda. Well, ISIS and Al Qaeda certainly are more willing to just kill people in the streets to make a political point. They don't have the overall depth of structure and backing that I think you see out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, arguments can be made to that as to which is more dangerous and why, but just overall depth of organization, funding and training and those sorts of reasons are why I would put Muslim Brotherhood as more dangerous under the current circumstances and within the context of Europe.
Okay, thank you very much.
Brad, and we know the immigration problem that you faced, and we all know, all right, we are experienced in that Turkey has already sent members of Muslim Brotherhood as a hidden cells inside the Egypt, inside the Greece, inside the Europe. And we know that already exist hidden terrorist cells inside the Egypt too, because they didn't vanish 100%. They didn't neutralize 100% the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. All right. So this is the question: is that those kind of these terrorists, right, motivated by manipulated by Turkey? And in case of a war or a conflict, how possible is this
100%
terrorist?
you can neutralize 50% of the nuclear commitment, right? So this is the question is that uh, those kind of these terrorists, right, motivated by manipulated by Turkey, and in case of a war or a conflict, these 100 terrorists, you can
Okay, forgive me as I do miss bits and pieces. So if I misunderstood anything, I beg your pardon in advance. But a couple of comments on this. The refugees that are being moved, now I'm talking specifically about the Muslim refugees that are being moved in large numbers from different places, including from Turkey, but also there's Syrian refugees and others. The Lebanese intelligence service came out probably a year and a half ago or so and said that there is a minimum of 1% of the total of those refugees that are agents of the Muslim extremists in one way or another. And that could be as integrated military cells that are trained. So absolutely, there's zero question whatsoever that there are trained cells that have been placed by extremist groups of various types in all of Europe and the United States and Canada for that matter. So that is a reality of the situation. They have not yet necessarily been activated on a large scale, but they are a potential destabilizing factor. It remains to be seen how large and how effective they could be because we simply don't know. I hope that was the crux of the question, if I understood properly.
All right. Yes, of course. And Mark, Iran is involved in what happened now in Libya, because it's a very strange here. All right, we see that the Russia has joint operations, patrolling and monitoring operations in Syria with Turkey. At the same time, in Libya, Russia is the country which support Haftar, right? And it is the opposite with the Turkish, let's say the Tripoli regime, which backed by Turkey. So in Syria, Russia is together with Turkey, but in Libya they're against each other. So Iran has influence on that, is involved in that.
I think certainly on the Syrian front, essentially, Russia does not believe it can fight both Turkey and Iran really at the same time in any meaningful way. And so it's got to sort of make its decision. What is its goal in Syria? And who represents a greater immediate threat to Russia's accession to being the winner in Syria? And if you look at the map, it's really I believe that Iran is the greater threat to Russia's being able to win Syria ultimately. And it's therefore, I wouldn't say it's having an alliance in Syria. I would say it's having more a modus vivendi at the moment, where they're just sort of frenemies in keeping some kind of status quo in the north, while Iran and Russia are really going to be battling it out as to who is going to claim the ultimate victory in Syria, which would be a strategic defeat for Putin if this were allowed to happen. And unfortunately, it is It is a battle between Iran and Russia in the southern reaches of Syria,
Uh,
except the northern part. And I just wanted to add something additional to the refugee issue. Uh, if you look at how Turkey has threatened Europe with waves of refugees, if Turkey doesn't get its way, it's really it's almost an extortion on a national level that at the moment, the only vector they have is really from Turkey into the West. Could you imagine if Turkey really exceeds the control of Libya with Libya's coastline and can not only threaten a soft invasion of refugees from Turkey, but also is going to be able to control a northern vector of refugees from Libya into Greece and Italy and all the various other countries that are exposed to the south of
Mr. Rack,
Europe.
talking about the Mediterranean neighborhood and talking for Iran, what's the role of Lebanon in all this Mediterranean situation?
Brad, you
Was
want
that to me? I'm sorry.
Excuse me?
Go ahead.
What's the role of talking about this neighborhood of Mediterranean Sea? What's the role of Lebanon in this whole situation? About
Well,
Mediterranean, Turkey, Greece.
I I would have to say that I think Lebanon it's difficult for Lebanon to be a major player in an organized sense because of the relative chaos there with the different groups fighting each other for control of different areas and their close proximity to Israel, where you have groups who particularly wish the destruction of Israel fighting for control. And there's been various times where they've kind of destroyed their predecessor and moved in. And I think you're seeing another round of that take place. So in an organized sense, I don't see Lebanon as a huge player. I would say more of a bit player. In the middle of that chaos, however, for larger players to come in and do what they want, then in that sense, Lebanon's important as a staging ground and lends itself to use and abuse by others. So not a huge factor as a country, but as a location, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, what happened, Mark, between Israel and Lebanon in the gas fields? Because today new headlines, I read that there was a, let's say, innocent misunderstanding about some gas fields between Israel and Lebanon. Can you explain that to us, please?
Well, it's
And
going to
what that
be
means? Because we know that the Hezbollah is still in Lebanon, right? And Iran, after the death of Rouhani and not Rouhani, excuse me, after
Romani.
the head of the dead, right? Yes, and thank you for that. And what happened there? What happened in Lebanon? Can you explain that?
Well, again, the key here is coastline and how you draw out a line from the coastline in determining how and what area of the Mediterranean is your economic, legitimate, in quotes, economic sphere. So there's going to be a fair degree of back and forth on the Lebanese-Israeli situation. But again, that is with Hezbollah and Iran essentially controlling southern Lebanon. This is a flashpoint that is going to be very tender and fragile for the foreseeable future. As to the exact line and demarcation and any terrorist acts against Israeli or gas extraction wells. It's going to be a very dicey and flammable situation.
Brad, is that true that France and Germany wants Turkey outside of NATO? Because we know that there's not exist our article that let's say order this describe a NATO country to get out of this huge organization. So there's no article like that. But recently
Correct.
we read that there is a yes.
You make a fabulous
Yes,
point,
please.
and that there is no exit, there's no method in place to kick a country out of NATO. So is it even possible? I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody knows. It hasn't really been looked at seriously enough that there's a specific answer to how that would be accomplished if it was even desired. As a realistic possibility, I think the chances of Turkey being forced out of NATO is very small. I don't see that as a particularly realistic option. But I wouldn't characterize France and Germany as like insisting that they want Turkey out. What they're doing is they're raising that as a point because domestically they're under pressure from Turkey in many ways, including the Muslim Brotherhood that we've already discussed and other groups. So I think they're feeling that pressure, and this is more of a political way to strike back at Turkey versus some sort of realistic expectation that Turkey's going to be forced out of NATO. I would put that as a very, very small chance of actually happening. But I think as a way to bring pressure to bear on Turkey, it is something that could be effective. And certainly, I think one of those things that's it's kind of in a reaction to the fact that they haven't seen any pressure coming out of the United States against Turkey for the most part. There have been some back and forth and pressuring back and forth on issues, but for things like this, for example, Turkey's activities in pressuring Europe to get what they want, threatening of the migrants that we've kind of touched on a couple of times, those sorts of issues, many of the European Union countries see that as a real danger, and so they're trying to push back, whereas the United States is basically kind of a little bit hands-off on those types of subject matters. So I think this is a European reaction to it, and as I think most people would agree, France and Germany tend to be the center of the EU. So it's interesting that that's the tactic that they've chosen and are using. But yes, your point, I think, is extremely well made, that there's really no method to actually kick a country out of NATO. So I don't think that is actually seriously being considered by anyone. Not that it shouldn't be, but I just don't think it's being considered by anyone seriously, anyone in a position of power.
Can I add a small little caveat to what Brad most excellently said? It isn't.
Of course.
I think it is not going to be so much as NATO kicking Turkey out of NATO as Turkey almost kicking itself out of NATO, in that they are engaging in extortion on numerous issues, not just on the issue of immigration and the sort of the threat of sending waves of migrants into Europe, but they have lately blocked core NATO defense initiatives in the Baltics because they didn't get what they wanted on whatever, Libya or whatever. And so you've got the core mission of NATO that is in effect being held hostage by Turkey on their particular pet issue, as well as, quite frankly, the threat to Greece, which is a NATO country, by Turkey. And one only has to look at Turkey's rather aggressive behavior in South Cyprus, where they're sending warships into South Cyprus to threaten gas rigs and so on and so forth. Now, can anyone imagine what would happen if Turkey sent a military vessel into the economic zone of Greece, where Turkey is claiming improperly through its Libya agreement access to dig into Greece's continental shelf? Under NATO, that would be an armed threat to a sovereign, the sovereign territory, integral territory of Greece. So I think Turkey needs to be pushed, and I agree with Brad that America has really been absent from pushing back.
That's a very interesting second option, that Turkey would itself sort of wind its way to the end of the process where it withdraws itself. That's probably the more likely scenario than being kicked out. And yeah, there's just no question that their plans include some fairly aggressive expansion. And if you look at how the Turkish government reports on these resources and like the drilling on the Greek off the Greek coast, they view those resources as belonging to them since it was previously conquered by the Ottoman Empire, and they're quite clear in discussions of that. Certainly, the top 3 or 4 people that are around Turkish President Erdogan make references to that all the time. The president himself makes references to it on occasion as well. So it's very clear that they view all of those resources as theirs, whereas, of course, most of the rest of Europe and NATO and Greece, of course, particularly, view Greek waters as Greek. And so that is a complete opposite perspective that we're seeing unfold. And those are the types of things where there's just simply no room for compromise, often lead to conflict. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some shooting take place in that region in the relative short term.
Mr. Johnson, I would like to direct the conversation to Russia. Yesterday, we read an article that a USA Navy in Europe and Africa, James Togo, said that Russia is turning the Eastern Mediterranean into one of the most militarized zones in the world thanks to the presence of submarines. US admiral warns of the danger of Russian submarines in the Mediterranean. What's your opinion? Is it true or false?
You'll have to forgive me. The connection with you is particularly poor from my end, so I apologize. I missed much of what you said, but what I heard you asking about was Russia and its role in the Mediterranean. Is that correct?
If I can clarify the question and correct me if I'm not. I believe Leo was asking about the Russian submarine threat to the Mediterranean.
Yeah. I see. Yes. Well, that certainly is a factor. There is no question whatsoever. And the Russian Navy in general as a threat is very real, and it's not something that should be ignored. And I think what we've seen them do in different areas, I think Ukraine then has to come into play. They've got some ports there now, and with what they've taken from the Crimea. And so we are seeing Russia clearly under Putin try to reestablish itself, essentially back out to at least the Soviet Union borders. And I would almost say it's a little bit similar to how President Erdogan in Turkey sees the former borders of the Ottoman Empire as essentially belonging to him. I think you would see Putin have kind of a similar perspective in the sense that he would view the former outward borders of the Soviet Union as essentially his. So he's going to look at that as the stomping ground for himself, and the Black Sea are areas that he's going to view as something that, if not completely under his sphere of control, at least partially under his sphere of control. And so I don't think there's a lot of doubt that Putin's willing to kill people along the way if he views it necessary. And would he be willing to use military assets to do that? I don't think there's any question. And would he use those submarines to take out a vessel carrying, say, arms to a place where he doesn't want them. I mean, I think there's potential for that. I don't think it's something that he's necessarily going to want to do right away, but certainly in gaming this out, that is absolutely one of the things.
Lost connection.
I'm sorry, but the connection is it's a very bad. The connection with Brad is very.
Apologies.
Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, I hear you.
I
The
have
weather there is very bad. As
7 more minutes before our ending, so I would like to complete the statement about the submarines and Russian. Mr. Johnson, can you hear me or not?
I hear you okay, but if Mark repeats the question, I hear him perfectly.
I think Leah wanted to have a specific answer, not on the Russian general order of battle, entry into the Mediterranean, but more pointedly, the Russian submarine threat to the Mediterranean. Is that accurate, Leah?
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Mr. Langfan, for this help.
Well, I guess I don't know if this is a specific enough answer, but I think the Russian capability to use those submarines and threat is very real. To me, they're not at the position where they're giving orders for them to go blow up vessels in the Mediterranean. Is it a real threat? Yeah, I would say it would have to be treated that way, but not in the sense of like immediate shooting. Is that the heart of what you were after, or is it something separate?
Okay, and one last question, maybe.
If I could add another aspect, Brad, I think that was what she was hitting at.
Okay.
You have to take all of this with an overlay of the Montreux Convention, which is the convention which allows Russia to transit through the straits from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean that are controlled by Turkey. And the real situation there is if you did have some type of attack on a Turkish, whether it's a de facto or de jure asset, military asset, in any of these areas, you could very well have Turkey claiming under the Montreux Convention that it is closing that strait. And that would be a precipitous and terrible situation where you could very well have a NATO invocation if somehow Russia was to forcibly try to exit the straits. So I don't know if it would have to be a decision that was a major decision by Putin as to what and how he would exactly execute on a military scenario in the Mediterranean.
My reading of Putin is that he would immediately push out some military vessels through. I don't think he would pull the trigger first, though. I think he'd wait to be fired upon and then answer accordingly and try to find some sort of commensurate, response that's equal level of force. But I think he would push through it immediately. That is something that we've seen that's part of his psyche. He consistently does things like that to kind of push the point through that he's not going to be stopped. So, and that again would be an area where it potentially could be dangerous. Russians and the Turks, don't really get along, and I can see that being an area where they could come to another flashpoint. There is potential danger there. There's no question.
Dear gentlemen, because we're before our ending, I would like to ask, after all this that we've been discussed today, I will close with the question that we open our conversation. What do you estimate about the future and prospects of this area during the next months? Mr. Langfan, you can tell your opinion first, please.
Well, unfortunately, I see not much of a change in the American position, which is really neither fish nor fowl. And maybe, as Brad has sketched out, in favor of Turkey, and therefore things are going to be left in the next couple of months to be on their own, and the real thing to focus on, in my view, is a decision by Egypt whether they are going to forcibly enter the Libyan theater with actual Egyptian troops.
You
Because
think the Egypt will be the key factor for the development during the next months?
I think that's the real thing to watch, is the Egyptian as well as the Russian level of assets chips that they want to put into Libya,
Okay.
and the consequence reaction of Turkey.
And Mr.
On,
Johnson,
thank
Do you
you. I understood your question this time. Thank you. The the United States position. Now I know we're only looking at 30 days out. I can guarantee you there will be zero changes that are significant in this arena taking place in the United States. The United States, the administration is completely locked in a political battle, and it's certainly where we've seen a lot going on in that sense. I won't go off into it, but there's just no question that that's actually sucking up all of the oxygen in the room for politics in the United States, at least now through November, and probably for a month or two after November, until perhaps the January timeframe. So I think there's zero chance of anything significant coming out of the United States as far as policy that would have impact. And the overall, yes, certainly the Libya thing, the coast of Libya, there's no question, is strategically very important to a lot of people, and the port and those things. So that's something that you can see where if Egypt doesn't move tanks in and armored vehicles, the things that have been discussed, there could be some serious pushback. My feel for it, and I may be wrong, this is just my personal feeling for it, is that there's very little chance of conflict almost in any way in the Mediterranean area for the next 30 days. I would, in the medium, that's the short term. In the medium term, I would start to raise the threat level up by a little bit. And certainly, again, the Turkish and Greek issue to me is one that could lead to shooting more quickly, although Turkey has seemed to kind of back down in some ways on that. But over the next 30 days, I don't think there'll be open conflict outside of the nature of what already exists.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Langton, it was a great honor having you and hosting you today in
Well, it was an honor being with Brad as well, and you, Leah, and Andreas.
Thank you, same, and also apologies for the internet connection from here. I'm sorry for the inconvenience to everyone.
It's okay, because the rest of our conversation was very interesting for us and our audience. So you are always welcome, even if we have technical issues.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind.
Good to hear you, everybody. Good night, everybody. Thank you very
God
much.
bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, too.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Brad.
And
Pleasure.
thanks our
Nice to meet you.
viewers.
Same.
Thank also our viewers. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
God bless you
All
all.
right. Good night, everyone.
Be well.
All right,
night.
bye.
We're
Thank
flight.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye. Good night.